I didn't become someone else overnight. I became them slowly. 10 seconds into this confession, here is the truth I avoided for most of my life: I didn't lose myself because I was weak. I lost myself because I was adaptable. From a young age, I learned how to read rooms. How to notice what people valued, what disappointed them, what made them comfortable. I adjusted instinctively. Not to manipulate, to belong. Belonging felt safer than authenticity. When I was praised, I remembered what I had done. When I was corrected, I remembered what not to repeat. Over time, those signals became my compass. I stopped asking who I was and started asking who I needed to be in each situation. That skill served me well. Teachers liked me. Authority figures trusted me. Friends found me easy to be around. I wasn't confrontational. I wasn't confusing. I fit. And fitting felt like success. I learned how to become the version of myself that caused the least resistance. The least concern. The least disappointment. I told myself this was emotional intelligence, the ability to adapt, to compromise, to be considerate. What I didn't realize was that I was outsourcing my identity. Every time someone reacted positively, that version of me gained weight. Every time someone disapproved, that version weakened. Slowly, my sense of self stopped coming from inside. It came from feedback. I didn't notice the shift because it wasn't painful at first. In fact, it made life smoother. Decisions became easier when I filtered them through expectations. I didn't have to struggle with uncertainty, the answer was often already implied. What would make sense? What would be acceptable? What would keep things stable? Those questions replaced a much harder one. What do I want? I stopped asking it. Not intentionally. Just gradually. I chose paths that were encouraged. Opinions that were agreeable. Reactions that were appropriate. I became good at anticipating disappointment and adjusting myself before it happened. People called me reliable. They didn't see how much of that reliability came from fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being difficult. Fear of being alone with my own choices. I learned how to be many versions of myself, but none of them felt complete. Each one existed for a specific audience. Each one disappeared when the room changed. At some point, I realized I didn't know which version was real anymore. I didn't feel fake. That's what made it dangerous. I felt functional. Days passed without friction. Conflicts dissolved before forming. I was praised for being mature, flexible, emotionally aware. No one suspected anything was wrong, including me. But late at night, when there was no one to perform for, I felt a strange emptiness. Not sadness. Not anxiety. Uncertainty. I would ask myself simple questions and struggle to answer. Do I like this? Do I want more? Is this enough for me? The answers didn't come. Not because I didn't care, but because I had trained myself not to listen. I realized how often I checked myself mid-thought. How quickly I dismissed reactions that felt inconvenient. How naturally I edited my desires before they could become demands. I had become fluent in restraint. And restraint had erased my voice. The unsettling part wasn't that people influenced me. It was that I had let their expectations replace my internal compass entirely. I had become what they wanted. And I didn't know who I was without them. That realization didn't hit all at once. It hovered. Waiting. And I didn't yet understand how much it was about to cost me. Once I saw how much of myself had been shaped by other people's expectations, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction became a mirror. I started noticing how quickly I adjusted my tone, my opinions, even my posture depending on who I was with. It wasn't conscious. It was automatic, like muscle memory built over years of quiet self-correction. I wasn't lying. I was adapting faster than I could think. That realization scared me more than any obvious deception would have. Because if I were lying, at least there would be a truth underneath. Something solid. Something waiting. What I found instead was uncertainty. I began to notice how dependent my sense of stability was on external approval. A kind word lifted me disproportionately. A hint of disappointment unsettled me for hours. Criticism, even mild, felt like an existential threat, not because it hurt my feelings, but because it shook the structure my identity rested on. If they disapproved, who was I? That question haunted me. I saw how carefully I had arranged my life to minimize that risk. I avoided strong opinions because they could divide. I avoided firm desires because they could conflict with someone else's plans. I avoided choices that couldn't be easily justified to an audience. I wasn't indecisive. I was afraid of standing alone with my decisions. The moment that forced this truth into the open wasn't dramatic. No one confronted me. No argument exploded. It happened in a pause, an uncomfortable, revealing pause. I was asked a question that should have been simple. What do you want? The emphasis landed differently this time. Not rhetorical. Not polite. Direct. I felt my mind search for an acceptable answer. One that would sound reasonable. Balanced. Mature. Nothing came. The silence stretched, and in that silence, panic surfaced. Not because I lacked options, but because I didn't know which answer belonged to me. I realized then that my desires had been filtered for so long that they barely existed in their original form. They were diluted, softened, adjusted to fit expectations before I ever felt them fully. I wasn't suppressing myself anymore. I had forgotten how to access myself. That realization hurt in a way I couldn't explain to anyone. Because on the surface, nothing was wrong. My life still worked. People still approved of me. I was still considered successful, reasonable, dependable. But inside, I felt hollow. I started to grieve, not for a specific loss, but for the version of myself that might have existed if I had trusted my own discomfort earlier. The version of me that might have argued, disappointed people, taken up space. I wondered when I had learned that being myself was dangerous. And I realized the answer was simple. I learned it every time approval felt safer than honesty. I saw how subtle the trade had been. No one forced me. No one demanded I disappear. I chose adaptation because it felt like connection. I chose compliance because it felt like belonging. But belonging that requires self-erasure comes with a cost. The cost is yourself. I began to feel a deep fear I had never named before, not fear of failure, not fear of rejection, but fear of emptiness. Fear that if I stopped performing, there would be nothing left underneath. That my personality was just a collection of reactions to other people's needs. That fear kept me frozen. Staying this way felt dishonest. Changing felt destabilizing. Because if I stopped being who they wanted, I didn't know who would remain, or whether anyone would stay. I was standing on the edge of a terrifying question. If I let go of the person they approved of, would there be anyone left at all? And I didn't yet know whether I was brave enough to find out. I didn't reclaim myself in a single decision. I dismantled myself slowly. The first thing I had to let go of was the idea that there was a real me hidden somewhere, waiting to be uncovered like a forgotten object. That fantasy was comforting. It suggested that identity was something fixed, something I could recover intact. The truth was harder. There was no untouched version of me left. There was only what I chose next. That realization felt like standing in an empty room after everyone had left. No applause. No instructions. Just silence, and responsibility. I began by disappointing people. Not intentionally. Not dramatically. Just by no longer adjusting fast enough. I hesitated before agreeing. I questioned assumptions I used to accept automatically. I admitted uncertainty instead of filling the space with what sounded right. I said, I don't know, and meant it. The reactions were subtle. Confusion. Mild frustration. Distance. Some people tried to correct me, gently, at first. They reminded me of who I usually was. What I normally did. How I typically handled things. It was meant kindly. But it felt like being pulled back into a shape I no longer fit. I didn't argue. I just didn't comply. That was enough to change everything. Approval began to thin. Not vanish, but weaken. The version of me people relied on became inconsistent. Less predictable. Less convenient. And with that loss came grief. Real grief. Because approval had been my anchor. It had told me who I was when I didn't know. Losing it felt like floating without reference points. I questioned myself constantly. Wondered if I was becoming selfish. Difficult. Unrecognizable. There were moments I wanted to go back. To readapt. To smooth things over. To disappear into usefulness again. That urge was strong. Because being wanted is intoxicating. But being wanted for who you pretend to be is a quiet kind of loneliness. I had to learn how to tolerate not being immediately understood. How to sit with the discomfort of disappointing expectations without rushing to fix it. How to make decisions without checking first how they would be received. That process was messy. I made mistakes. I overcorrected. I mistook honesty for bluntness and freedom for detachment. I had to relearn how to relate without performing. Slowly, something unexpected happened. A sense of solidity began to form. Not confidence, alignment. My reactions stopped feeling delayed. My words carried weight because they weren't optimized. My presence felt grounded because it wasn't conditional on approval. I wasn't always liked. But I was no longer invisible to myself. Some relationships didn't survive the change. That loss hurt more than I expected. Because it confirmed what I had feared, that parts of my value to others had been tied to my compliance. Letting that go felt like mourning a life I had lived for a long time. But other connections shifted in a different way. They deepened. People who could tolerate my uncertainty, my edges, my slower responses, they stayed. And with them, I felt something I had never felt before. Seen. Not for what I provided. But for who I was becoming. I learned something I wish I had understood earlier. You don't lose yourself because others expect too much. You lose yourself because you stop asking whether what you're becoming belongs to you. Reclaiming myself didn't mean becoming louder or more assertive. It meant becoming responsible for my own inner direction, even when that direction confused others. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, someone who has learned to adapt so well that they no longer know where they end, I won't tell you to reject people's expectations entirely. I'll tell you this. Notice which versions of you only exist for certain audiences. Notice how often approval decides before you do. Notice where belonging costs you your voice. You don't wake up one day and realize you've lost yourself. You wake up one day and realize you've been replacing yourself for years. I let other people decide who I should be. When I finally stopped, I didn't find a clear answer to who I was. I found something harder, and more honest. The freedom to choose. And even now, even when it's uncomfortable, that freedom feels closer to life than anything I lived before.